John Miller was a man who lived a life defined by service. A retired New York cop with decades of experience under his belt. A respected firefighter who had saved countless lives. And a father who took pride in his family. He was the kind of man people trusted. Steady, reliable, the person you'd want standing next to you in a crisis. For 57 years, John dedicated himself to protecting others, putting his life on the line without hesitation. He had seen the worst of humanity and faced it head-on. But the threat that would ultimately end his life wasn't one he could have prepared for. It came from within his own home. Just days after John reported his 43-year-old son Christopher missing, that very same son would be the one to take his life. A father's final moments, not spent protecting his community, but caught in a terrifying confrontation with his own child. How did it come to this? How does a son become the greatest threat to a man who had faced danger his entire life? What was going through Christopher Miller's mind in the moments leading up to that deadly encounter? And the question that lingers, could someone have seen this coming? Could John Miller's death have been prevented? This isn't just a story about a crime. It's about family, mental health, and the hidden fractures that can turn a household into a crime scene. What led Christopher Miller to commit the unthinkable? And were the warning signs there all along? John Miller's life was built on a foundation of service. From a young age, he seemed destined for a life of duty, the kind of person who always showed up no matter the circumstances. He grew up in New York, raised with the belief that strength and responsibility went hand in hand. Those close to him said John had a quiet confidence, the type of person who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. It wasn't surprising when John decided to join the New York Police Department. Protecting others wasn't just a job, it was who he was. He entered the academy with a quiet determination, quickly earning a reputation for being calm under pressure. In a city that never sleeps, John became a steady presence. He wasn't the kind of officer who sought recognition, but he was the one others trusted when things got dangerous. Whether it was breaking up a violent altercation or talking down a suspect on the edge, John handled it with the same steady hand. Years passed, and John rose through the ranks. His colleagues respected him not just for his work ethic but for the way he treated people with dignity even when they didn't deserve it. He saw the worst sides of humanity, the moments that broke weaker men. But John never lost his center. He carried the weight of those experiences quietly, never letting it show at home. His badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of the responsibility he carried every day. After retiring from the NYPD, most men would have walked away, grateful to leave behind the long shifts and constant stress. But John wasn't built for idleness. He found a new sense of purpose as a firefighter with the Wyandanch Volunteer Fire Company. To John, running into burning buildings wasn't a thrill, it was a calling. While others were running out, John was running in, doing whatever it took to protect others. 57 years of service between the police force and the fire department, a lifetime of putting others before himself. But John's real source of pride wasn't his career. It was his family. He married his wife decades earlier, and together they raised their son, Christopher. John was a proud father. He wasn't overly expressive, but those who knew him said his devotion to Christopher was clear. When Christopher struggled, John supported him. When Christopher made mistakes, John was there to guide him. He believed in his son even when others had doubts. That's what made what happened next so hard to comprehend. Because for all the danger John had faced over the years, the criminals, the fires, the chaos, the greatest threat was quietly growing under his own roof. And he never saw it coming. Christopher Miller's life was complicated. From the outside, he appeared to have a normal upbringing, the son of a respected cop and firefighter raised in a stable home. But those who knew Christopher well saw the cracks early on. He was a quiet kid, reserved, sometimes distant. Teachers noted that he struggled to connect with other children. He had a hard time forming friendships, and when he did, they often didn't last long. Small conflicts would escalate quickly. Christopher would shut down, sometimes disappearing for hours before coming home without a word. As Christopher got older, the distance grew wider. He became more isolated, withdrawing from family gatherings and avoiding conversations with his parents. John and his wife grew concerned, but Christopher wouldn't open up. He became unpredictable, calm one moment, on edge the next. There were signs of deeper issues, but John, a man who had spent his career solving other people's problems, struggled to get through to his own son. Mental health professionals were brought in at different points over the years. Christopher had been prescribed medication in his early 20s, but he never stayed consistent with treatment. Some days he seemed stable, almost like his old self. Other days he was cold and detached, avoiding eye contact, speaking in short, clipped sentences. John tried to support him. He encouraged Christopher to find a steady job, to seek help, to build a life for himself. But nothing seemed to stick. Then came the car accident. On March 17, 2025, Christopher was involved in a high-speed crash just a few miles from the family home. The details were disturbing. Witnesses said Christopher was driving erratically before he veered off the road and slammed into a tree. When emergency responders arrived, Christopher was conscious but combative. He refused medical treatment, shouting at the paramedics and pushing them away. When police arrived, Christopher grew even more aggressive. Officers had to restrain him to get him into the ambulance. John was called to the hospital that night. He sat quietly in the waiting room while Christopher was evaluated. The doctors couldn't say for certain whether Christopher was under the influence or if it was a mental health episode. What they did say was that Christopher needed further care. But Christopher walked out of the hospital hours later, refusing to speak to anyone, including his father. John had seen this kind of behavior before on the job. He had talked to parents whose children had fallen through the cracks. He had seen what happened when mental health issues went untreated. But this was different. This was his son. Days after the accident, Christopher disappeared. He wasn't answering his phone. He hadn't shown up to the house. John grew concerned. A father's instinct told him something was wrong. On March 18th, John filed a missing person report with the Suffolk County Police Department. He described Christopher's recent behavior, the erratic driving, the aggression at the hospital, the emotional distance. John was worried. He feared Christopher was in danger, that maybe he would harm himself or someone else. Officers took the report. They promised to keep an eye out. But John couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He stayed up late that night, sitting in the dark with his phone in his hand, waiting for Christopher to call or walk through the front door. He would have given anything to see his son standing there, safe and whole. But when Christopher finally did return home, it wasn't safety he brought with him. Christopher Miller returned home on the evening of March 19, 2025. John had been sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. He had barely slept since filing the missing person report 3 days earlier. Every sound outside had made him sit up, hoping it was Christopher coming home. And now finally, Christopher was back. But something wasn't right. Neighbors would later say they heard the door slam hard enough to shake the walls. John stood up, relief mixed with concern as Christopher walked through the front door. But Christopher wasn't himself. His eyes were wide, unfocused. He was muttering under his breath. His movements were sharp, almost aggressive. John approached carefully, his voice steady as he asked where Christopher had been. Christopher didn't answer. John had spent his career de-escalating dangerous situations. He had faced down armed suspects and talked people out of life-threatening situations. He knew how to handle confrontation. But this was different. This was his son. Christopher's hands were trembling. His breathing was sharp and uneven. John reached out, trying to calm him down, but Christopher pulled away. The tension in the room was building. John took a step back, his instincts telling him to slow things down, to give Christopher space. But Christopher stepped forward. No one knows exactly what was said in those final moments. What's clear is that the situation escalated fast. Christopher's voice rose. John tried to steady him, to calm him down. Christopher's hand disappeared into his jacket. Then a gunshot. John stumbled back, clutching his chest. A second shot followed. John collapsed to the floor. Christopher stood there for a moment, the gun shaking in his hands. Then he dropped it. He backed away, his breath ragged and uneven. His father, the man who had spent his life protecting others, lay motionless on the ground. Neighbors called 911 after hearing the shots. Police arrived within minutes. When they entered the house, Christopher was still standing over his father's body, his expression empty. Officers shouted at him to drop to the ground. He didn't resist. He barely moved. He was placed in handcuffs and led outside, the flashing lights of the squad cars washing over his face. Christopher was taken into custody without incident. When officers questioned him, his answers were flat, detached. He admitted to shooting his father. There was no struggle, no attempt to run, Just a quiet admission. I shot him. John Miller, a man who had survived decades of violence and danger in the line of duty, had been killed in his own home by the very person he had spent his life trying to protect. Christopher Miller was taken into custody without resistance. When officers arrived at the Miller home on March 19, 2025, the scene they walked into was chilling. John Miller lay motionless on the floor, 2 gunshot wounds in his chest. Blood pooled beneath him, the stillness of the room broken only by the sound of Christopher's shaky breathing. Christopher stood there, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his expression distant. When officers ordered him to the ground, he obeyed without hesitation. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. His face remained blank as they placed him in handcuffs and led him outside. As Christopher was escorted to the police car, neighbors gathered at the edges of their driveways, stunned. The flashing lights of the squad cars reflected off the dark windows of the house. People whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. John Miller, the man they had seen mowing his lawn, chatting with neighbors, and playing with his dog, was gone. And his son, the quiet figure they had rarely seen, was now being driven away in the back of a police car. At the station, Christopher was processed and placed in an interrogation room. Investigators asked him to explain what happened. His responses were flat, unemotional. He admitted to shooting his father. No excuses. No justifications. Just cold acceptance. I shot him, he said. When pressed for a motive, Christopher gave little insight. He seemed detached, as though the weight of what he had done hadn't fully registered. Prosecutors moved quickly. Christopher was charged with second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon. The charges carried the potential for life in prison. At his arraignment, Christopher appeared emotionless. He stood quietly as the judge read the charges. His public defender entered a plea of not guilty. Christopher remained silent. His eyes were fixed on the floor. The community struggled to process the tragedy. John Miller had been a fixture in Wyandanch, the firefighter who showed up to help when someone's house was on fire, the retired cop who had once patrolled their streets. The idea that he had been killed was hard enough to comprehend. But the fact that his own son had pulled the trigger left people shaken. Christopher's mental state quickly became a focus of the case. His erratic behavior leading up to the shooting, the car accident, the aggression at the hospital, the emotional distance, raised questions about his mental health. Some speculated that Christopher had suffered a psychotic break. Others argued that years of untreated issues had finally come to a violent conclusion. John's wife, Christopher's mother, was left to face the unimaginable. Her husband was gone. Her son was now behind bars, charged with his murder. In a single night, her family had been shattered. As Christopher sat in a holding cell awaiting trial, the question that haunted everyone was the same: could this have been stopped? Were the warning signs ignored for too long? Or was this outcome always inevitable? Christopher Miller's mental health had been a growing concern for years. Those closest to him knew that something was wrong, even if they couldn't fully understand what it was. As a child, Christopher had always been quiet, maybe too quiet. He had trouble fitting in at school, struggled to keep friendships, and often retreated into himself when things got difficult. Teachers described him as intelligent but emotionally distant. When conflicts arose, Christopher's reaction was unpredictable. Sometimes he shut down completely. Other times, his anger would flare up without warning. By his teenage years, the cracks in Christopher's mental state had become harder to ignore. His moods were erratic. He would lash out over small frustrations and then retreat into isolation for days at a time. John and his wife tried to get Christopher help. Therapists were brought in. Medications were prescribed. But Christopher resisted. He hated talking about his feelings. He hated the way the medication made him feel slow, foggy, disconnected. He would stop taking the pills after a few weeks, slipping back into old patterns. There were warning signs. Christopher had been involved in several minor incidents over the years: fights at school, outbursts at home, episodes where he disappeared for hours without telling anyone where he was going. Police had even been called to the Miller house once after Christopher got into a heated argument with his father and punched a hole in the wall. But each time, John handled it privately. He was a cop. He had dealt with troubled kids before. He believed he could reach his son. After high school, Christopher drifted. He enrolled in community college but never finished. He picked up a few jobs, retail, construction, but nothing stuck. He would quit without explanation. His social life was nearly non-existent. The few friends he did have described him as intense. He would go through long stretches of silence and then suddenly show up out of nowhere, talking fast and agitated. John grew more concerned as Christopher's behavior became harder to predict. He encouraged Christopher to go back to therapy to find some kind of structure. But Christopher was resistant. He became more defensive when John brought it up, sometimes walking out of the room or leaving the house altogether. The car accident on March 17, 2025 was a tipping point. Witnesses described Christopher's driving as reckless. He was speeding, weaving through traffic almost as if he wanted to crash. When police arrived at the scene, Christopher was belligerent and aggressive. The doctors at the hospital suspected Christopher had experienced some kind of psychological break, but Christopher refused further evaluation. He left the hospital against medical advice. When John filed the missing person report the next day, he knew his son was on edge. He feared Christopher was unraveling. But even John couldn't have imagined what would happen next. Experts would later weigh in on Christopher's mental state at the time of the shooting. Some speculated that Christopher suffered from undiagnosed schizophrenia or a severe personality disorder. Others suggested that years of untreated depression and anxiety had culminated in a psychotic episode. Whatever the diagnosis, the conclusion was clear: Christopher had been struggling for a long time. And despite John's efforts to help his son, the system had failed him. Family violence linked to mental health issues is not uncommon. Studies show that individuals with untreated mental illness are more likely to engage in violent behavior, especially when substance abuse, isolation, and lack of treatment are involved. Christopher's case was particularly tragic because the warning signs were there, but the support he needed either wasn't enough or came too late. John Miller had spent his life protecting others. But when it came to his own son, even he couldn't prevent what happened. John Miller's life was defined by service. For more than 2 decades, he served with distinction as a New York City police officer. He patrolled some of the toughest neighborhoods, walking streets where danger was a daily reality. He made arrests, prevented crimes, and built relationships with the people he swore to protect. John wasn't just another officer, he was known for his calm demeanor, his sharp instincts, and his ability to connect with people. Fellow officers described him as steady, the kind of guy you wanted by your side when things got dangerous. John's rise through the NYPD was steady and well-earned. He moved from patrol officer to detective, taking on high-profile cases involving violent crime and drug trafficking. He was respected not only for his investigative skills but for his ability to read people. He had a gift for getting suspects to talk, for noticing the smallest details that others missed. His colleagues said John could walk into a room and immediately sense when something was off. After retiring from the force, John didn't slow down. He transitioned to a career as a firefighter in Wyandanch, Long Island, a move that surprised some of his colleagues. But John saw it as a natural continuation of his life's work. If he couldn't protect people on the streets anymore, he would protect them in their homes. He quickly earned the respect of his fellow firefighters. He was the first to volunteer for dangerous calls. He never hesitated when lives were on the line. One firefighter recalled a house fire where John ran into the building without waiting for backup. A young child was trapped on the 2nd floor. John fought through the smoke and heat, carrying the child out in his arms. He never spoke about the incident afterward. He didn't want praise. He saw it as part of the job. But John's legacy wasn't just about his professional accomplishments, it was about the relationships he built. He was the guy neighbors called when they needed help. He'd shovel a driveway for an elderly neighbor without being asked. He was known for showing up at Little League games, not because he had to, but because he wanted to support the kids in the community. At barbecues, John was the one standing by the grill, flipping burgers and cracking jokes. He made people feel safe. His fellow officers and firefighters were shaken by his death. The idea that John, a man who had faced down career criminals and charged into burning buildings, had been killed in his own home by his own son was hard to comprehend. At his funeral, rows of police officers in dress blues and firefighters in full uniform lined the church steps. The sound of bagpipes filled the air as John's coffin was carried out. His wife stood at the front of the church, clutching the folded American flag that had draped John's coffin. Tears streamed down her face. Christopher's absence was palpable. Some couldn't help but wonder if Christopher even understood the weight of what had happened. John Miller's death left a hole not just in his family but in the community he served. His fellow officers said they had lost a brother. His neighbors said they had lost a friend. And yet, John's legacy remained. He had dedicated his life to protecting others. And in the end, despite the tragic way his life ended, that legacy of service and strength is what people would remember most about him. John Miller's life was a story of service, strength, and sacrifice. He spent decades protecting the streets of New York City as a respected police officer, facing down danger and making a difference in the lives of countless people. Even after retiring from the NYPD, he continued his mission to serve others as a firefighter, running into burning buildings when others ran out, saving lives without hesitation. But John's life ended not on the streets or in a burning house, but in the place where he should have been safest. Shot and killed in his own home by his own son. The questions that followed were painful and difficult. Could this have been prevented? Did Christopher's mental health issues create a path that no one could stop? Or were there signs that everyone missed? Christopher Miller's struggles had been evident for years: the isolation, the erratic behavior, the emotional distance. He had been in trouble before. He had shown signs that he was spiraling. But despite John's efforts to guide him, to protect him, it wasn't enough. Christopher's mental health issues remained untreated, his anger unaddressed. The car accident on March 17, 2025, might have been the final warning, but by then it was already too late. The night of March 19, 2025, left a permanent scar on everyone involved. John Miller's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a failure of the system to catch Christopher's decline before it turned deadly. Mental health experts have pointed to this case as an example of how fragile the line can be between instability and violence, how quickly a loved one can become a threat, and how devastating the consequences can be when the warning signs are ignored or misunderstood. John's death shook the law enforcement and firefighting communities. The man who had protected so many couldn't protect himself from the threat inside his own home. His funeral was a testament to the life he lived, officers, firefighters, and community members standing shoulder to shoulder, mourning a man who had given everything to his city and his family. Christopher's future remains uncertain. His mental state at the time of the shooting will undoubtedly play a role in the court proceedings. Some will see him as a cold-blooded killer. Others will see him as a deeply troubled young man who never got the help he needed. Either way, the outcome won't change the fact that John Miller is gone and that his death leaves behind unanswered questions and a sense of loss that may never fully heal. In the end, John Miller's legacy is not defined by the way he died, but by the way he lived. He was a protector, a father, a man who dedicated his life to keeping others safe. And while his death remains a painful reminder of how fragile life can be, his legacy of service and strength will live on in the people he helped and the lives he touched. The story of John Miller is a tragic reminder of how even the strongest among us can face battles we never see coming. A man who spent his life protecting others, taken too soon by the very person he had tried to protect the most. Christopher Miller's struggles with mental health paint a painful picture of how untreated issues can escalate into irreversible consequences. The warning signs were there, the troubled past, the emotional distance, the growing tension, but in the end, it wasn't enough to prevent the unimaginable. John Miller's death left behind a void not only in his family but in the community he served. His fellow officers and firefighters still speak of his strength, his kindness, and his dedication. But beneath the grief lies an unsettling truth: how fragile the line can be between love and tragedy. How even those closest to us can become strangers when mental illness and desperation take hold. Thank you for watching. If you found this story impactful, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, don't wait, seek help. Sometimes a conversation can make all the difference. Until next time, take care and stay safe.